Hello, and welcome to Readings in English. Here on this channel, we explore the beauty and versatility of the English language through captivating stories. Whether you're just starting your English learning journey or looking to improve your skills, you're in the right place. English is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. It's a bridge that connects cultures, opens doors to opportunities, and tells incredible stories that inspire and unite us. Learning English is not just about words, it's about understanding new perspectives and connecting with people across the globe. Today, I'm excited to share a deeply emotional and inspiring story with you. It's called The Words We Couldn't Say. This story follows Maria, a mother from a rural village, who embarks on a heartfelt journey to reconnect with her son, Daniel, after years of separation. But there's a challenge. Maria and Daniel speak different languages. Determined to bridge the gap, Maria takes on the daunting task of learning English to communicate with her son, and along the way, she discovers her own resilience and strength. It's a tale of love, perseverance, and the power of language to connect us, even when it seems impossible. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into this moving story filled with lessons not just about language, but about life. Let's begin. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across Maria's small, weathered house. She sat at the edge of her modest wooden table, organizing old papers and knickknacks that had accumulated over the years. The task was routine, something she did to keep herself occupied after long days of work as a housekeeper in her village. Today, however, the humdrum activity led her to a discovery she hadn't anticipated. Tucked beneath a pile of faded utility bills was a photograph. The edges were frayed, and the colors had started to dull, but Maria recognized it instantly. In the picture, a little boy no older than 3 grinned at the camera, his chubby fingers clutching a toy car. His wide, toothy smile tugged at Maria's heart, and the memories came rushing back. The boy was Daniel, her son. Tears welled up in her eyes as she held the photo close. It had been years since she had last seen Daniel. Her circumstances had left her no choice but to give him up for adoption, a decision that had haunted her every day since. Maria placed the photo on the table and exhaled deeply, steadying herself. That was when she noticed something else, a neatly folded letter that had been tucked behind the photograph. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The words were written in English, a language she didn't understand, but certain words stood out. Daniel, meat, and mother. She could only piece together fragments, but the implication was clear. Her son wanted to meet her. Her heart raced with a mixture of joy and panic. What would she say to him? How would she even begin to communicate? Maria looked around her small, quiet home, feeling the weight of years spent in isolation and longing. The photograph and letter lay before her like a challenge she wasn't sure she could face. The next morning, Maria woke with the first light of dawn, the photograph and letter still on the table where she had left them. She had barely slept, her mind spinning with thoughts of Daniel, Her heart ached with the desire to see him, but a new obstacle loomed large in her mind. English. Maria had grown up in a rural village, where education was a luxury few could afford. Her knowledge of English was limited to a few words she had picked up from old television shows. How could she possibly hold a conversation with her son, who had grown up in a world so different from hers? After finishing her chores, Maria walked to the local school where she cleaned classrooms part-time. The small building stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by fields of corn. As she scrubbed the desks, her mind wandered back to the letter. She thought of Julia, the school's teacher, who had always been kind to her. Perhaps Julia could help. When the students left for the day, Maria approached Julia, clutching the letter tightly. "Miss Julia, can you help me with this?" she asked hesitantly. Julia, a woman in her mid-30s with a warm smile, took the letter and glanced at it. "Of course, Maria," she said, sitting down at a desk. She read it aloud, translating the words into Spanish as she went. The letter was from Daniel's adoptive parents, explaining that he had expressed a desire to meet Maria. They suggested arranging a meeting in the coming months. Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know English," she whispered. "How can I talk to him?" Julia placed a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. "You can learn, Maria. It won't be easy, but I can help you. We can start with the basics." Maria hesitated. She was nearly 50 and had never been a quick learner. "Do you really think I can do it?" she asked. "I do," Julia said firmly. "It's never too late to start." That evening, Maria returned home with a borrowed English primer and a notebook. Sitting at her kitchen table, she opened the book to the first page and began tracing the unfamiliar letters with her finger. It was daunting, but as she practiced pronouncing simple words like hello and thank you, a glimmer of hope flickered within her. For the first time in years, Maria felt like she was taking a step toward the future she had longed for. The days in Maria's village began early, with the sun rising over the cornfields and casting a golden hue on the modest homes. For Maria, this morning was different. A mix of nervousness and determination coursed through her as she gathered her notebook and the English primer Julia had lent her. She hurried to the schoolhouse, where Julia had offered to give her a lesson before the students arrived. "Good morning, Maria," Julia greeted warmly as Maria entered the small classroom. Desks were arranged neatly, and sunlight poured in through the large windows. "Are you ready for your first English lesson?" Maria nodded hesitantly, clutching her notebook as if it were a lifeline. "Yes, but I'm not sure I'll be good at this," Julia smiled, pulling out a piece of chalk. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to start. Let's begin with greetings. If Daniel says hello, you respond with hello," Maria repeated, her voice shaky but earnest. Julia continued, slowly building on simple phrases like "How are you?" and "Thank you." As Maria practiced, she stumbled over the pronunciation, but Julia encouraged her with patience. They laughed together when Maria mistakenly said thank you, imagining a soldier's armored vehicle instead of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, Maria felt a lightness in her heart. "Practice these phrases tonight," Julia said as their lesson ended, "and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn." Maria left the schoolhouse with a sense of accomplishment. The words felt clumsy on her tongue, but each one brought her closer to Daniel. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, repeating the phrases to herself in the flickering light of a single candle. Her voice echoed softly in the small room, and though the words were imperfect, they carried the weight of her resolve. As Maria worked her way through the English primer, memories of Daniel as a child began to resurface. Each word she practiced seemed to unlock a fragment of the past a bedtime story, a lullaby the way his small hands used to tug at her skirt. The bond they had shared felt so distant now, yet so vivid in her mind. One evening, after a particularly challenging day of practice, Maria closed the primer and reached for the photograph of Daniel. She traced his smiling face with her finger, whispering, "I hope you still remember me, Mihio." Suddenly, an idea struck her. She rummaged through an old chest in the corner of her home, pulling out a stack of faded notebooks. These were the stories she had written for Daniel when he was little, tales of animals in the forest, brave explorers, and magical worlds. Her hand shook as she opened one of the notebooks and began to read aloud. The stories, once a source of joy for both of them, now became her guide. Maria decided to use them as practice material. She would translate the stories into English, word by painstaking word, to prepare for her reunion with Daniel. The next day, she brought one of the notebooks to Julia, who agreed to help her with the translations. Together, they worked through the story of a bird searching for its lost nest. Maria struggled to find the right words, but Julia patiently guided her, explaining grammar and pronunciation along the way. "You're doing well," Julia said after an hour of work. "And these stories are beautiful, Maria. They'll mean so much to Daniel." Maria smiled faintly, the praise giving her strength to continue. "I hope he remembers them," she said softly. They were our special moments that night as Maria sat alone with her notebook. Translating the stories became a way to bridge the gap between the past and the present. Each word felt like a small victory, a step closer to the connection she longed to rebuild. Despite the difficulty, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The sounds of the village quieted as the night deepened, but Maria's home remained alight with quiet whispers of English phrases and the steady scratching of her pen. In her heart, she held on to the hope that these stories would help her reach across the years and the miles to find her son again. The sun filtered through the thin curtains of Maria's kitchen. She stared at the worn notebooks spread across her table. Each story she translated brought her closer to Daniel, but the effort drained her physically and emotionally. The English lessons were expensive not in money, but in time and energy. Maria was already juggling her housekeeping jobs, and the hours spent studying left her exhausted. One morning, while preparing to leave for work, Maria opened a small wooden box tucked away in the corner of her bedroom. Inside was a pendant that had belonged to her late mother, a delicate silver piece in the shape of a bird. It was one of the few possessions Maria held dear, a reminder of her family's history. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, a lump forming in her throat. Later that day, Maria made her way to the village marketplace, where local traders sold everything from fresh produce to handcrafted goods. She approached a jewelry vendor and hesitantly placed a pendant on the counter. "I need to sell this," Maria said quietly, her voice tinged with regret. The vendor examined the pendant, offering her a modest sum. It was less than she had hoped, but Maria accepted it. The money would allow her to buy a second-hand English-Spanish dictionary and a few more notebooks. As she walked away, the weight of her decision settled on her shoulders. The pendant had been a piece of her past, but she was willing to part with it for a chance at a future with her son. That evening, armed with her new dictionary, Maria returned to her translations. Each word felt like a tribute to the sacrifices she had made. Though her heart ached for the loss of the pendant, the thought of Daniel kept her going. The days passed in a blur of work, lessons, and late-night study sessions. Maria's progress was slow but steady. She could now greet Julia in English and even form simple sentences. Yet, despite her efforts, she often felt as though she were climbing an endless hill. One afternoon, as she returned home from work, Maria found an envelope waiting on her doorstep. Her name was written neatly on the front in bold, unfamiliar letters. She immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Daniel's adoptive parents. With trembling hands, Maria opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words were in English, but this time she could decipher more than just a few scattered phrases. "Daniel, learning Spanish, and wants to meet," stood out clearly, and her eyes filled with tears as the meaning sank in. The letter explained that Daniel had been learning Spanish in preparation for meeting Maria. He had been asking questions about her life and wanted to hear her stories. The adoptive parents suggested arranging a meeting in the coming months, giving Maria a timeline for her preparation. Maria pressed the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy and pressure. If Daniel was making an effort to learn Spanish, she felt an even greater responsibility to master English. The thought filled her with both excitement and fear. What if she couldn't do it in time? What if her words faltered when it mattered most? The following day, Maria shared the news with Julia, who beamed with pride. "This is wonderful, Maria. It means he's thinking of you, too." "Yes," Maria said, her voice quivering. "But it also means I must try harder. I can't let him down." From that moment, Maria redoubled her efforts. She spent every spare moment practicing her pronunciation, memorizing vocabulary, and perfecting her translations. The stories she once told Daniel as a child now became her bridge to him, and each word felt like a thread weaving their lives back together. As the weeks passed, Maria began to feel the weight of her sacrifices lifting slightly. The progress she made, no matter how small, reminded her that she was not alone in her efforts. Across the ocean, Daniel was trying too. That thought gave her strength, and for the first time in years, Maria began to believe that their reunion was truly possible. Maria sat at her kitchen table, her hands carefully turning the pages of one of her old notebooks. This story, about a bird searching for its lost nest, had been one of Daniel's favorites. The memory of him giggling as she imitated the bird's chirps filled her with warmth. Now that same story served a new purpose. It was her way of practicing English. She read aloud in halting English, stumbling over words and correcting herself with the help of her dictionary. The little bird looked for its nest, she murmured, pausing to scribble translations in the margins. Her voice echoed softly in the quiet house, each word an offering of hope. The next morning, she brought the notebook to Juliet during one of their lessons. "I want to translate this," Maria explained, placing the notebook on the desk. It was Daniel's favorite story when he was little. Julia's eyes lit up. "That's a beautiful idea, Maria." Sharing this with him in English will mean so much. Together, they worked through the text. Julia explained grammar rules, pronunciation, and the nuances of certain phrases. Maria struggled at first, often slipping back into Spanish, and she grew frustrated, but Julia's patience and encouragement kept her going. As the translation took shape, Maria began to see the story in a new light. The bird's journey mirrored her own search for something precious, guided by determination and love. She felt a surge of pride when they finished the first draft. Though it was far from perfect, it was hers, and it carried a piece of her heart. When Maria returned home at evening, she read the story aloud again, this time with more confidence. The little bird searched everywhere, but it did not give up, she said, her voice steady. The words felt like a promise, not only to Daniel, but also to herself. Maria's progress in English was slow but steady, and her confidence grew with each passing day. However, not everyone in the village shared her enthusiasm. One afternoon, as she carried her notebook through the marketplace, she overheard two women whispering nearby. "She's wasting her time," one said, shaking her head at her age, learning English. "What for?" Maria's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept walking, clutching her notebook tightly. The words stung, but they also ignited a spark of defiance. She refused to let their doubt deter her. Later that day, during her lesson with Julia, Maria confided in her about the comments. Julia frowned. "Don't listen to them, Maria. What you're doing is brave and important." "They don't understand your reasons," Maria nodded, though the words still lingered in her mind. That evening, as she sat down to practice, her doubts resurfaced. The words blurred on the page, and frustration bubbled to the surface. "Why is this so hard?" she muttered, slamming the notebook shut. She sat in silence for a moment, her head resting in her hands. The weight of her efforts balancing work, lessons, and her emotions felt overwhelming. For the first time since she had begun this journey, she considered giving up. But then her eyes fell on the photograph of Daniel sitting on the table. His smile, so full of life and innocence, reminded her of why she had started. Maria picked up the notebook again, flipping to the story of the bird. The little bird did not give up, she whispered, repeating the line like a mantra. The next morning, Maria returned to her lessons with renewed determination. She practiced speaking aloud, even when the words felt awkward in her mouth. She wrote translations until her hand cramped, and she ignored the whispers of doubt, both from others and from within. Each small victory, a correctly pronounced word, a phrase understood without hesitation, brought her closer to her goal. The journey was far from over, but Maria refused to let setbacks define her. She had come too far to turn back now. Maria's progress continued steadily, but her struggles with time and resources persisted. She often found herself wishing for more hours in the day, especially when work left her too tired to study. One evening, while practicing in her kitchen, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Standing outside was Pedro, a middle-aged man who had lived in the village his whole life. Known for his gruff demeanor, Pedro rarely stopped by to socialize. Maria was surprised to see him. "I heard about what you're doing," Pedro said, gesturing to the notebooks on the table. His voice carried an edge of skepticism, but his eyes held curiosity. "Learning English for your son?" Maria hesitated, unsure of his intentions. "Yes," she replied simply. Pedro reached into a bag he carried and pulled out a stack of old magazines. "I used these when I worked in the city. They're in English. Figured you might find them useful." Maria's eyes widened. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched by his unexpected kindness. "They're old," Pedro muttered, almost embarrassed. "But maybe they'll help." The magazines, though worn and outdated, were a treasure trove of new words and phrases. Maria spent hours poring over them, circling unfamiliar vocabulary and trying to piece together their meanings. One article about birds reminded her of her own story, and she eagerly shared her progress with Julia during their next lesson. "These magazines are perfect," Julia said, smiling as she flipped through one. "You can practice reading and pick up new words at the same time." Pedro's gesture marked a turning point for Maria. It showed her that even in a small village, support could come from unexpected places. Encouraged by his help, Maria felt her determination deepen. She began incorporating the magazines into her routine, reading aloud, even when the words felt foreign and clumsy. Her confidence grew with each new word she learned, and she started to feel the gap between her and Daniel slowly narrowing. Though there was still much work to do, Maria could sense that she was on the right path. One crisp morning, Maria arrived at the school for her lesson with Julia carrying her usual stack of notebooks. To her surprise, Julia greeted her with an unusually excited smile. "Maria, sit down. I have something to show you," Julia said, motioning toward her desk. Curious, Maria took a seat. Julia handed her a printed page, with a long list of names and small handwritten notes beside each one. The people in the village and some from nearby have come together to help you, Julia explained. We've raised enough money to buy you a plane ticket to see Daniel. Maria's breath caught. She stared at the paper, trying to comprehend what Julia was saying. A plane ticket, she repeated, her voice trembling. But how? Everyone wanted to help, Julia said. You've inspired us, Maria, the way you've worked so hard to learn English and reconnect with your son. It's moved all of us. Even those who doubted you at first. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes. I don't know what to say. This means everything to me. You deserve this, Maria, Julia said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Now you can focus on preparing for the trip. For the first time, the possibility of seeing Daniel felt real. The thought of boarding a plane and meeting him face to face filled Maria with equal parts excitement and fear. She knew the reunion would be emotional, but it also represented the culmination of her efforts. That evening, Maria sat at her kitchen table, holding the printed page with the list of names. Each name represented someone who believed in her, who saw the value in her journey. It was humbling and empowering at once. Maria resolved to make the most of the time she had left before the trip. She doubled her efforts and her lessons, practicing her phrases until they flowed naturally. The thought of seeing Daniel kept her motivated, even on the most exhausting days. With the ticket secured and her goal within reach, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just dreaming of reconnecting with her son. She was on the verge of making it a reality. Maria held her boarding pass tightly as she waited in line to board the plane. The hum of announcements in English buzzed around her, making her feel both small and determined. It was her first time leaving the village, let alone traveling to another country. Every step felt surreal. As she moved forward with the line, her mind raced with thoughts of Daniel. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, nerves twisted in her stomach. When she finally stepped onto the plane, Maria marveled at the rows of seats and the hum of engines. She followed the flight attendant's instructions carefully, clutching her bag with the notebook containing her translated stories. This small book had become her anchor, a bridge to Daniel and a source of comfort. The flight was both exciting and overwhelming. Maria listened intently as the attendants spoke in English, trying to catch familiar words. She repeated phrases under her breath, rehearsing what she might say when she saw Daniel. "Hello, Daniel. I am happy to see you," she whispered softly, her accent thick but her determination unwavering. As the plane descended, Maria stared out the window, watching the sprawling city come into view. The buildings and highways stretched endlessly, so different from the quiet village she called home. Her heart pounded as the plane landed and taxied to the gate. Navigating the airport was a challenge. The signs were in English, and the hurried pace of travelers around her made her feel lost. But she held on to the instructions Julia had written down for her, following them step by step until she reached the designated meeting area. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bag. The anticipation was nearly unbearable. This was the moment she had dreamed of, the culmination of months of effort and sacrifice. Maria scanned the crowd of faces, searching for one she hadn't seen in years but would recognize instantly. And then there he was, Daniel, taller and older than she had imagined, but with the same warm smile she remembered from the photograph. Her breath caught as their eyes met. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel approached her hesitantly, his hands tucked into his pockets. His adoptive parents stood a few steps behind him, offering encouraging smiles. For a moment, neither Maria nor Daniel spoke. The years between them hung heavily in the air, but the connection was undeniable. Finally, Maria managed to say, "Hello, Daniel." Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Hello," Daniel replied, his Spanish accent thick but clear. He had been practicing, just as she had. The sound of her name on his lips sent a wave of emotion crashing over her. Maria reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. She held it out to him, her hands trembling. "This, for you," she said, her English faltering but understandable. "Your favorite stories." Daniel took the notebook, his eyes scanning the cover. "I remember this," he said, switching to Spanish. His voice carried a mix of nostalgia and curiosity. He opened the notebook, his expression softening as he recognized the stories. Maria felt a lump in her throat. "I learn English," she said carefully, gesturing to the notebook. "For you," Daniel looked up, his eyes glistening with emotion. "And I learned Spanish," he replied, switching languages seamlessly. "For you." The connection between them grew stronger with each word, each phrase exchanged. They laughed at their shared mistakes, their imperfect sentences becoming a language of their own. The notebook became a central part of their reunion, sparking memories and creating new ones as they shared its contents. By the time they left the airport, Maria felt the weight of the years apart beginning to lift. Though their journey was just beginning, this first meeting was proof that love and determination could bridge even the widest gaps. Maria sat across from Daniel at a small cafe near his home. The aroma of coffee mingled with the sounds of the bustling city outside. Daniel's adoptive parents had stepped away to give them time alone, sensing the importance of this moment. Maria took a deep breath, still holding the notebook that had become the symbol of her journey. "This story," she began, pointing to one of the translated tales about the little bird. "Do you remember?" Daniel nodded, a small smile bugging at his lips. "You used to tell it to me before bed," he said in Spanish, his voice warm with nostalgia. "You even made bird sounds." Maria chuckled softly, imitating the chirps as she had done years ago. Daniel laughed, the sound filling her with a joy she hadn't felt in years. "I wrote it in English," she said carefully, sliding the notebook toward him. "I read to you." Daniel's eyes widened with surprise, but he nodded. "Yes, please." Maria opened the notebook to the story of the bird searching for its nest. Her voice trembled as she began, stumbling over the unfamiliar words but pressing on. The little bird looked for its nest. She read, her accent thick but her effort evident. As she spoke, Daniel leaned closer, his gaze fixed on her face. When she struggled with a word, he gently corrected her, their shared laughter lightening the moment. "You're doing great, Mama," he said softly, slipping into Spanish for the word that carried so much meaning. Hearing him call her Mama brought tears to Maria's eyes, but she continued reading. The story unfolded, its message of perseverance resonating deeply with both of them. By the time she finished, Daniel reached out to take her hand. "This story," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is not just about the bird. It's about us." Maria squeezed his hand, her tears falling freely now. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's U.S." For hours they sat together, sharing memories and bridging the years of separation. Maria told him about her struggles to learn English, and Daniel shared his own challenges in learning Spanish. Their efforts mirrored each other, both motivated by the desire to connect. As the sun began to set, Daniel looked at Maria and said in hesitant Spanish, I know where my nest is now." Maria's heart swelled with pride and love. Though their words were not perfect, the meaning was clear. They had found their way back to each other. The day of their farewell arrived all too quickly. Maria stood at the airport, her suitcase by her side. Daniel and his adoptive parents were there to see her off. The time they had spent together had been transformative, but saying goodbye was still bittersweet. "I'll call you," Daniel said, his Spanish improving with each word. "We'll talk every week," Maria nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And I will call you too," she replied in English, her voice steady despite the emotion. "I will practice." Daniel hugged her tightly, holding on as though to make up for all the years they had lost. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered. For not giving up, Maria's heart felt full as she boarded the plane. The journey back to her village was quieter, filled with reflection and a sense of accomplishment. She had not only reconnected with her son, but also discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. When Maria returned home, she found a small group of villagers waiting for her. News of her reunion with Daniel had spread, and many wanted to hear her story. She shared her journey, emphasizing the importance of determination and love. Inspired by her experience, a few villagers asked her to teach them English. Maria began hosting informal lessons at the school, using the same methods Julia had taught her. She shared her translated stories, including the tale of the little bird, encouraging others to find their own nests through language and connection. As she stood in front of her small class one evening, Maria realized that her journey was far from over. Though she had achieved her goal of reconnecting with Daniel, the lessons she had learned along the way had opened new doors. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her story could inspire others to chase their own dreams. The photograph of Daniel, now older but still smiling, sat on her table. beside it lay the notebook filled with translated stories, a testament to the journey that had brought them back together. Maria picked it up, her fingers tracing the cover, and smiled. This was not the end, it was the beginning of a new chapter.